Hi again. Still in James Denny. James Denny, by the way, was another famous Presbyterian writer and thinker of the same generation as James Orr, so I always get them confused. This is James Orr, Sidelights on Christian Doctrine, Chapter 2. We're still in the attributes of God, and here he's dealing with God as spirit, personal spirit, and then with the classical attributes of omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. Orr says the determination of God's being as the absolute, just specified, lie behind everything else in God. They are the attributes which give, in fact, to his perfections their quality as God's. They do not, however, yet tell us all that God is. We only reach the full conception of God when we think of him further as free personal spirit. God is a spirit, John 4:24. He is not, as some schools of thought imagine, impersonal, but personal spirit. It would be out of place here to enter into elaborate discussions about personality. Enough to say that the essential marks of personality are found in these three things: self-consciousness, character, that is ethical character, and will. Any being of whom these three things can be affirmed, and they are really inseparable, can be declared to be a person. It belongs then to the idea of God that he is 1, spiritual, 2, personal, and 3, free. 1, on spirituality it is not necessary to dwell. The Bible assumes throughout that God is distinct from nature, has no material form, is universally present, etc. From him proceeds the Spirit, but he from whom the Spirit proceeds must be himself spiritual. 2, much greater difficulty arises with the conception of personality. This, some contend, is incompatible with infinity. Personality, it is argued, excludes as well as includes. It implies distinction from another. An infinite personality, therefore, one which has no limitation in any direction and leaves nothing outside itself, is a contradiction in terms. Some would solve this problem by ascribing to God what they call a universal personality. That is, by making God simply the self-conscious center of the universe, and giving him the contents of the universe, our own thoughts and actions included, as the contents of his consciousness. But this solution is pantheistic in principle, and really makes God but the principle of unity in the world. The real answer is to be sought for in another direction. The philosopher Lotze has rightly argued that so far from personality being necessarily finite, man's personality is only a faint copy of the perfect personality of God. Man is limited and is conscious of his limits in knowledge and in other things. He is constantly seeking to break down these limits. In knowledge, for instance, he is constantly seeking to break down the limits between himself and the world. He does not lessen his personality as he takes more of the world into it, but enlarges it. If he could break down the barriers altogether, as in absolute omniscience, he would not abolish personality, but would perfect it. The objection, in truth, rests on that quantitative way of conceiving of infinitude, which has already been referred to. Personality is not a quantitative, but a spiritual magnitude. The infinity of God's being and perfections does not exclude the existence of relative and dependent being. No other such being as God can indeed exist, but relative dependent being can very well exist without detracting from any perfection that God possesses. Third, freedom is involved in spiritual personality. God's sovereign freedom is everywhere assumed in Scripture. This leads to the consideration of the specific attributes of God in their two divisions of natural and moral. The natural attributes relate to God's presence, knowledge, and power, each conceived as infinite, that is, omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence. The moral relate to his perfections as holy and may be grouped under righteousness and love. Problems of no small interest arise in connection with each. I speak first of the natural attributes of God. Scripture everywhere assumes the omnipresence of God, but it is an undue limitation of omnipresence to conceive of it as simply universal presence in space. God is present also in the world of mind. The term properly denotes God's presence absolutely. His presence to all creatures, wherever being is, or can be thought of as existing. If I ascend up to heaven, thou art there, according to Psalm 139, verses 8 to 10. In relation even to the external world, God must be thought of as present to all objects in space, rather than as himself in space. For the same reason, he is wholly present to all beings everywhere, not part here and part there, as if he were extended in space. This is the fault of the term immensity as applied to God. One must think also of a moral nearness and distance of God to individuals, to which spatial categories do not at all apply. Most amazing of the natural attributes of God is his omniscience. While we understand perfectly the meaning of our statement that God knows all things, we feel that both the manner and the extent of this knowledge pass our comprehension. God's knowledge, unlike ours, is not successive and gradually acquired, but is intuitive. It is not partial, only part of it before consciousness at any given time, but is eternally and unchangeably complete. Is not imperfect and relative as ours is, knowing in part, seeing as in a glass darkly, but is immediate, unerring, answering to the inmost truth of things. It is pure, undimmed, unbroken light, and the fountain of light to others. As respects the objects of omniscience, God knows himself and all the mystery unfathomable to us of his own counsels, according to Acts 15, verse 18. Knows the whole universe of created existence, matter and spirit, in its inconceivable vastness, complexity, minuteness of parts, subtlety of thought, volition, motion. Knows the universe of the possible as well as of the actual. Knows the future equally with the present. It is this last aspect of God's omniscience, as foreknowledge, especially as regards the free actions of men, which presents the most baffling problem to our thought. Where necessity rules, God can foreknow. But a free act is thought of as one which originates solely with the agent. How then, it is asked, can it be foreknown before even the agent with whom alone it lies to determine when or what it shall be, as so much has been brought into existence? The difficulty is so great that some have been led to deny foreknowledge of free actions altogether, a position contradicted by everything in Scripture. Others take the opposite course of denying human freedom. For instance, Jonathan Edwards and many of the Reformed theologians have difficulties with absolute freedom of humans. Some evade the difficulty by speaking of God as above time. His being is an eternal now. But while God, as above seen, is not in time, it must yet be held that time is a reality for God. There is a past, present, and future in the history of the world. That which is future is not yet, except in idea, even for God. And this still leaves the problem unsolved as how it can be foreseen. A solution of this problem, doubtless there is, though our minds fail to grasp it. In part, it probably lies not in denying freedom, but in a revised conception of freedom. For freedom, after all, is not arbitrariness. There is in all rational action a why for acting, a reason which decides action. The truly free man is not the uncertain, incalculable man, but the man who is reliable. In short, freedom has its laws, spiritual laws, and the omniscient mind knows what these are. But an element of mystery, it must be acknowledged, still remains. God's knowledge, when applied to the realization of ends, is his wisdom. The last of the specific natural attributes of God is his omnipotence. Power, as we saw, is the root idea in the name Elohim, that is God. Our own ideas of power are derived from the exercise of will, but God's power differs from man's, in that man's personal power is never creative. It is limited to selection and control. Power in God, on the other hand, is constitutive and creative. It brings into being, relative, dependent being, no doubt, what did not exist before. It's no objection to the omnipotence of God that it is limited to the sphere of what is possible to power. cannot, for instance, work contradictions. It is limited also in its exercise by God's moral attributes. The question here is not simply what God can do, but what he will do. And it can be laid down with confidence that God will never do that by which he would deny himself in a moral respect. The only other limitations to the power of God are self-imposed, arising from regard to the nature of things he himself has established. Thus, ordinarily, God abides by the order he has established in nature, reserving the right to supersede this order for higher ends if he sees fit, that is, miracles. Similarly, he limits his action by regard to the laws of moral freedom. Yet, in creation and providence, he rules all things and manifests his supremacy even in a world of sin. So I'm going to link to a video we did in the series, Who Really Are Jehovah's Witnesses. It was on Paradise Lost, Psalm 102, a psalm where we are told that Yahweh appears in all his glory. An inconceivable appearance, according to the theology of many of the sects and cults, especially Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. And Islam, we might add. And then another track we did on Genesis, Yahweh appeared to Abraham. They're on your screen now. And next time, the moral attributes of God.